Aretha Franklin was a traumatized child, a teenage mother, a gospel prodigy, and a civil rights champion. She channeled a world of pain into a sound of her own, but till the end, the greatest singer of her generation remained a mystery. This is the life of Aretha Franklin. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Stage and Score with Poppy. I am your host, Poppy, and I'm so excited that you're here today because this is a brand new series that I'm doing on this channel. It is titled Legacies Unplugged, and in these series, we're specifically going to talk about the life and the legacy of music legends, just to better understand and appreciate their life as well as the legacy that they have created for us, some unfortunately left behind. And actually, today I am recording on Christmas Day. So, Merry Christmas, and I hope everyone is having a great holiday season. I hope you all are enjoying the last few days of the year, and I hope a great brand new year for everyone. I hope if you are into music, you can listen to these stories during your time off and enjoy a little bit. Since I am recording on Christmas Day, which is commonly known as the birthday of Jesus Christ, what better way to start by talking about a woman who was known for her legendary gospel career as well as being the Queen of Soul? I am talking about Aretha Franklin. You have probably read the description already, so let's get into it. For us to better understand the life and the legacy of Aretha Franklin, we first need to go way back to her early childhood and her birth because trust me, she had a completely different and very unique upbringing compared to other soul, R&B, and gospel legends of her time. Aretha Louise Franklin was born on March 25th, 1942. She was born to her parents, Barbara Siggers and Reverend C.L. Franklin. CL stands for Clarence Lavon, but we are going to refer to him as CL moving forward. Her mom, Barbara, was a native to Memphis and she was the fourth of seven children. Barbara also had some roots in Mississippi, and she really developed a love for gospel singing and gospel music in general at a young age when she attended church with her family. Barbara did grow up to become a extraordinary gospel singer. She was very often compared to the likes of Mahalia Jackson, Clara Ward, and other gospel legends of her time. However, once she married the Reverend Franklin, she stopped kind of being active in the music scene and took more of a motherly role in her life. Prior to marrying CL, Barbara actually had a son from another relationship. His name was Vaughn, and he goes on to become Aretha's half brother as well. Although Barbara was a talented singer and a beautifully skilled piano player, a lot of her personal life and achievements are commonly overshadowed due to the nature of her relationship with C.L. Franklin. But kind of going over everything that I could find from Barbara, it is very safe to say that Aretha inherited her talent for music, her singing voice, as well as naturally playing the piano from her mother, Barbara. Aretha's father, C.L. Franklin, honestly became more of a complex character as I was doing my research for the episode. And we are going to get to a lot of the intricacies of his life and his legacy as well. C.L. Franklin was born in 1915 in Mississippi. His father, Willie Walker, was a World War I draftee. You might say his last name is Franklin, his father's last name was Walker. That is because when CL was 4 years old, Willie Walker abandoned the family and A year after that, CL's mom married a man by the name of Henry Franklin, and CL adopted the last name of his stepfather. CL has recalled that he never really had any relationship or any memories associated with his biological father, and he truly went by the last name of Franklin as he grew and he made a name for himself. C.L. Franklin was from a sharecropping family, and very early on, he learned the value of hard work and perseverance. He was also lucky in a sense that at a very young age, around 10 or 12 years old, he developed a fully mature voice that was very moving, and he used it to preach as early as 16 years old, actually. When he was 16, C.L. Franklin started preaching at a circuit church in the South, and he was known for blending biblical stories with the hardship of the African American experience that people were facing at that time. By 18, C.L. Franklin became the pastor at the New Salem Baptist Church in Memphis. 1 year after that, he married his first wife, Eileen Gaines. And there is not really a lot known about his first marriage, the nature of it, or how the couple separated. But very soon after they got married, they actually separated, and eventually CL met Barbara Siggers, Aretha's mom. On June 3rd, 1936, CL married Barbara, with whom he went on to have four children. Upon marrying Barbara, CL actually embraced her son and welcomed him as part of the family, and I think eventually adopted him. While he was the pastor at the New Salem Baptist Church, C.L. Franklin became very famous for his sermons. He started developing a unique style in his preaching, which was more of a call and response that engaged the congregation with him and created an atmosphere of engagement, raw emotions, and fulfillment, essentially. While C.L. Franklin himself had a very humble beginning, he was no longer a country preacher and he was becoming a more sophisticated pastor. And the church very often overflew with people who wanted to hear him speak. A lot of people viewed him as an inspiration because they also wanted a better life for themselves, and they saw CL, his life story, and his sermons as a way for them to better themselves as well. Reverend Franklin's career started to change when he took his sermons beyond the church. He started using the radio as a form of communication so he can preach to more than the few hundred people who could see him on a weekly basis at the church. While he was still in Memphis, he started a radio program called Beyond the Shadow of the Cross, and he used it to preach to a vast number of people and inspire the African American community of the time. By 1944, the family moved from Memphis to Buffalo, New York, where Reverend Franklin became the pastor at the Friendship Baptist Church, and Barbara directed the choir. His radio programs, however, did not stop. He had yet another radio program while he was in Buffalo named Voice of Friendship. And in this specific program, he blended gospel music with his sermons and very often talked about the future of America after the Second World War and the concept of social equality. In 1945, just a year after the family had moved to Buffalo, C.L. Franklin appeared in the National Baptist Convention in Detroit, and there he delivered a speech which was very impressive. He had at that point fully developed his voice, his act of preaching, and he was a very famous and popular pastor in his own right, which is why he was invited to become the pastor at the new Bethel Baptist Church in Detroit. This meant the family had to move one more time, and so they did. The family moved from Buffalo to Detroit, and amongst a lot of things that we're going to talk about, anything that happened to Aretha, her family, her parents, siblings, I think these series of moves from Memphis to New York and then to Detroit was the start of many wins and loses for Aretha and her entire family. Had it not been for her father's career and had it not been for the family moving to Detroit, Aretha might really not have become the gospel star that she became, at least not that young. Aretha and her siblings grew up in the heart of the church, always listening to their father's sermons as well as the hymns performed by the choir there. But unfortunately, as Reverend Franklin's career was flourishing, his marriage was unraveling. I am fully aware that this story is about Aretha, her life, and her legacy. And she has had such a full life that I needed to rewrite and cut a lot of stories and a lot of recounts in order to make it short enough that I can tell it in one podcast format. But I think it's important to acknowledge some of the events that happened in Reverend Franklin's life because they also affected Aretha and her childhood and her as an adult. And it's important for us to know and kind of have that insight as well. In 1948, Barbara took her son from her previous relationship and left the family. This is not because she wanted to abandon her children. This is not because she didn't love her children. For a long time, there was not a public explanation as to why this happened, how this happened, and what was the aftermath. But now we do know that a series of infidelities on the part of the Reverend Franklin was a contributing factor to Barbara leaving, especially after the Reverend had a child with another woman in his congregation, and that woman herself was 12 years old at the time that she gave birth to Reverend Franklin's daughter. In lieu of everything, Barbara chose to leave and go to Buffalo with her son, and she had family in Buffalo. But it's not like she abandoned the other Franklin children. She just simply could not take all of them because when she moved to Buffalo, she started living with family and she had to take a job as a night nurse in order to pay for her and her son's life, and having four more children was not really a financially feasible option for Barbara at the time. This especially was the case because the family was doing well financially in Detroit. Thanks to the flourishing career of C.L. Franklin, the family moved to a six-bedroom mansion in a desegregated and racially integrated neighborhood within Detroit. After Barbara left, there were other women who were friends or family who would help raising the children, including Reverend Franklin's mom, who the kids called Big Mama, as well as gospel legend Mahalia Jackson, who was a friend of the family. But also, the Reverend could afford hiring maids and housekeepers, which he did. This is what I'm talking about. Aretha had, financially at least speaking, from a comfort level, she had a life like none of the other singers, musicians, and artists of her time. She was upper class technically, and um, her view on life and a lot of the decisions that she made over time were affected by her upbringing, in fact. As the 1950s approached, so did the golden years of gospel music. Because of the reputation that the New Bethel Baptist Church had, many of these gospel musicians who were famous at the time would often visit and perform during services. One of these singers was a woman by the name of Clara Ward. Clara was part of a gospel group called the Ward Singers. The Ward Singers were known for the role that they played in revolutionizing gospel music and introducing an entertainment aspect to gospel performance in general. They ditched the old robes that the singers would wear and they introduced glamour, fashion, and flair into gospel music. They actually became so famous that they started playing secular venues and even went as far as playing in the Sin City of Las Vegas. But one key moment that shaped Aretha's love for gospel music and performance happened during a service and Clara Ward's performance during that service. When Aretha was about 9 years old, Clara performed during a funeral service in New Bethel, and she started singing to honor the deceased. And she was so overcome by emotions and so moved that she took off her church hat and threw it on the ground. This was known to be an act and a sign of deep emotional movement that gospel singers did at the time if they were so overcome by the situation. This was really a pivotal moment for Aretha because she really understood the connection between God, music, emotions, and she really had a feeling in her that she wanted to be someone like Clara Ward, who was so unique and so honest in her performance and showing of her emotions. And this actually goes to make a full circle journey and come back towards the very end of her career. And I'm just getting goosebumps talking about it because it's really my favorite part of this story, to be perfectly honest. But regardless, Clara Ward did shape a big part of Aretha's love for gospel music. But that was not the only effect that Clara Ward had on Aretha. She was known to have an on again, off again relationship, romantic relationship with the Reverend C.L. Franklin, which some say started as early as 1946 and went on until Clara Ward passed in 1973. But this was more of an open secret. It was not something that people talked openly in the church or anything of the sorts. But amongst private groups, this relationship and Ward and CL were kind of known to be the Ike and Tina Turner of the church. But again, none of these conversations were public. No one ever acknowledged them as a couple publicly. It was all very hush hush. And Aretha herself never in throughout her life admitted that there was a romantic component in Ward's relationship with her father, and she always said that they were very good friends. But regardless whether or not Aretha ever admitted to the nature of that relationship, this presence of Clara Ward in the Franklin family shaped a lot of Aretha's understanding and attitude towards public life and how you're supposed to kind of behave and how much you're supposed to reveal. And to be perfectly honest with you, there are some key moments and incidents that has happened to her in her early childhood that shaped her animosity towards the media and how she wanted to open up to the public or not really open up to the public. And even though I think as she became the public figure that she was, and she was really judged by the things that she said about her private life, how much of it was true, how much of it she was like making up to make herself look good. But I really cannot really, not that I don't, I really cannot blame all of that on Aretha herself, because when you are very young and you all of a sudden have a half sister whose mom is a 12-year-old who went to your church, or when your mom leaves and now you see your father with your idol, or a lot of other things, and no adult really talks about it, no adult really brings it up, tries to address it. There is not a great precedent for any child, let alone a child that's going to grow up to become a mega celebrity. But CL Franklin's relationships didn't just end with Clara Ward or gospel singers. He was known to frequent the jazz scene, and he actually was offered to start a career as a jazz musician, but he believed that his voice and his persona was there to serve God, so he never really ventured into music out of the church. Regardless, he had a lot of friends who would frequent the Franklin house, including B.B. King, Ella Fitzgerald. The presence of these musicians really shaped Aretha's early music education. But aside from that, Aretha had an amazing talent for playing the piano. Her brother recalls that when they would listen to jazz records together, Aretha could immediately go to the piano and replicate the song that they heard just simply from playing it by the ear. She never really had a lot of classic musical training. She actually didn't even like that. It was very much natural to her. She was very much an intuitive player. And of course, she was a beautiful piano player. After Barbara moved, things were very hard for the children. Another reason why we know she didn't just abandon her kids is because Aretha and her siblings would often visit their mom in Buffalo either during summer vacation or in the winter, and Aretha would play the piano with her mom, sing with her, and these became very cherished memories for her. But unfortunately, in 1952, Barbara passed away due to a heart attack. This, of course, was very hard for Aretha, and just a few months after her mom's passing, she had her first ever church solo performance where she sang Jesus Be a Fence Around Me for about 1,500 people. Of course, her grandma was there to cheer her on, but everyone was, of course, impressed by her and moved by the sadness and the love that she had in her voice as a result of this recent passing of her mom. When Aretha was about 12 years old, her father started to manage her musically. But he also had a show during the summer, which was kind of like a gospel caravan that he took his sermons as well as musicians on the road to have performances in other churches, venues, conventions, even on the radio. And they went through America. I think they went as far as California. And it was CL's way of kind of expanding his horizons and being able to preach to more people. And he took Aretha with him. Aretha was at first part of the opening act with the choir. Sometimes she played solo at the piano. Eventually, she was, of course, a sensation and she had her own act. If we take this experience, this gospel caravan experience, completely in isolation and look at it musically, it was a great experience for Aretha to have. She was very young. She learned how to travel as a musician. She learned how to work with other musicians. She was exposed to a lot of gospel greats, and that's perfect. But looking at it more holistically, as someone who I don't have a kid right now, but at some point I would like to, thinking about a 12-year-old girl, black girl in the 50s, traveling with a caravan of adult people who could not go to any hotel or motel that they wanted because this was unfortunately during segregation, and just being on the road for months at a time, and her father not being there always because the Reverend Franklin had to fly back and forth because he had multiple obligations and preached in a lot of places that were not part of this caravan. I'm not so sure about what kind of environment the Reverend was creating for his very young daughter. And he is, of course, as we have talked about it, the kind of person who simply chose not to talk about a lot of the hardship that Aretha went through. And he was kind of the reason behind that. Because when Aretha was about 12 years old, she had her first child. She had four children, and the first of those four children was born when she was about 12 years old. Her second child was also born when she was very young, not long after her first. And her father, who was her manager, her guardian, and the person who was exposing her to all of these new experiences and situations, never addressed a lot of things that she went through as a child. Technically, 12 is a child. Regardless of any of this, she loved her children. This is not about whether or not she wanted or loved her children. This is more about her father and his level of responsibility and care. Aretha loved her kids. She helped raise them, but of course, she was very young. She was starting a career. So, Big Mama and her sisters also helped raising her first two children. Soon after Aretha was back from her gospel roadshow, she was able to record 9 songs live at the new Bethel Baptist Church in Detroit. A local recording company by the name of JVB, which also was helping the Reverend Franklin to release his radio sermons, was able to set up recording equipment at the church where Aretha sang and played the piano live for this album. The songs from this album were released as singles and another album throughout time, but in 1965, Checker Records, which was a subsidiary of Chess Records, like if you've seen the movie Cadillac Records, that Chess Records, was able to release the album titled Songs of Faith, which had all the 9 tracks that Aretha recorded live, plus some other unreleased material. At that point, it was becoming clear to everyone who knew Aretha and knew her talents that she was going to become a star. Aretha's journey to becoming the Queen of Soul started when she joined Columbia Records in 1960. And with that, we are done talking about Aretha's early years, and we're going to dive into her tenure at Columbia Records. But first, a little break. Okay, let's get into Aretha's tenure at Columbia Records. By the time she was about 18 years old, Aretha confided in her father that she wanted to pursue secular music. She was kind of inspired to do this by the career change that one of her idols went through by the name of Sam Cooke. He started pursuing pop music and he was quite successful at the beginning of his career and continued to be successful. And she confided in her father, who was also her manager at the time. He supported her and helped her produce 2 demo tracks for record companies to consider. Around that same time, Smokey Robinson, who was a friend of the family as well, had released a single with Motown Records, and he was very successful with this single. He had sold about 1 million copies of it, and in general, Motown seemed like a natural fit for Aretha. At this time, music was still quite a bit segregated. R&B was very much dominated by black artists, and that's where they thrived, and Motown was successful in producing those records. So they did approach CL Franklin to sign Aretha, but he declined. He believed that for Aretha to become the star that she wanted to be, she had to work with the best and the biggest. And of course, Columbia Records at that time was the epitome of the best and the biggest. They had already worked with the Franklin's family friend Mahalia Jackson, but also Duke Ellington and Leonard Bernstein also worked with them. Columbia was also interested in working with Aretha and they signed her. In hindsight, I don't know if we can tell not working with a label like Motown was good and going with Columbia was the wisest choice. Regardless, Reverend Franklin got his way. But we are going to talk about this looking at Aretha's years, I think about 7 years at Columbia, from a bird's eye view, they did put her on the map. They did shape her presence in the music scene. There is no doubt about that. But they missed the talent and the voice that was Aretha Franklin time after time, album after album, record after record. And by the time Aretha's contract was up, she actually owed the label money because she was not at all commercially successful. This is mainly because, to the admission of Columbia's own producers, no one there knew what to do with Aretha. They were not familiar with her voice, with the power that she had, with her gospel roots, and they just always wanted to make her fit into these predefined personas of artists that they knew and they were familiar with and they knew how to market. Of course, if she had signed with Motown, she would have worked with people who were very much familiar with her talent, her voice, and her strength. But of course, they probably could not have marketed her the way Columbia did. I came across an article while I was doing research for this episode, and the the article itself was not specifically about Aretha. It was about Black artists who, at the same time that Aretha was active, who kind of bridged the gap between the R&B and the pop charts and kind of integrated themselves and the music into the mainstream. And they talked about how none of the other specifically female artists could enter the mainstream integrated music arena while Aretha and Diana Ross had their songs playing on the radio. And at least in the case of Aretha, it's mainly because she worked with people who were not just about R&B, who were not just well connected within the African American music industry, the black music industry. She actually worked with titans of the industry who could introduce her to the entire country and not just a specific section of the country. So, just like a lot of other things, this decision by C.L. Franklin and Aretha had its own ups and downs, of course. After signing with Columbia, Aretha moved to New York to start her career as a recording artist. And at the beginning of her career with Columbia, she faced a lot of challenges. One of them came in the form of a disagreement with her father. When she moved to New York, she knew that she needed like an events manager there in the city with her who has label connections and can help her navigate her way in the city. And her father, who was her actual manager, was coming up with choices of people that Aretha didn't really agree with. He was coming up with mainly men and people of backgrounds that Aretha was not comfortable with. And she kept putting him down. She kept rejecting his choices. And this disagreement brought forward an incident, which is the only time Aretha herself has talked about a physical altercation that was initiated from her father. So basically, they could not agree on who she wanted to hire as a manager, and her father was not happy that she was rejecting his choices, and he initiated a physical fight with Aretha. Although there has been a lot of other recounts by people who are not Aretha regarding the Reverend's temper and other altercations physically that he started, this seems to be the only time that Aretha herself has talked about her father kind of being physical with her. Okay, before we move forward, because we are going to mainly talk about Aretha's career at Columbia, I want to say something real quick about C.L. Franklin because we just talked about this incident and kind of the character that he had and the relation that he had with Aretha, and as a pastor overall, the character that he had, because we've been talking about him, having extramarital affairs, being physical, kind of being hard headed in some senses. But I think this little paragraph that I came across sums things together perfectly. This is from a Rolling Stone article. I will try and link it down below for you as well. But it basically says, and I'm just gonna read it real quick here. As Nick Salvatore wrote in Singing in a Strange Land, C.L. Franklin, The Black Church, and the Transformation of America, can imperfect people perform good deeds? Can a flawed minister lead others to salvation? CL certainly thought so. And I think this is really the best way of looking at the complexities of the relationship between CL and Aretha. He knew that he was a flawed person. He was preaching for people to find God, to be better versions of themselves while having extramarital activities himself, while being short tempered and sometimes violent, and a lot of other things that I don't think we need to talk about here. But he also believed that while he himself was flawed, he was given this voice and this talent to help other people achieve their dreams or become the best version of themselves. And to an extent, he was trying to do the same thing for his daughter. However, his strategies and his behavior was clearly not the best that they could be. But eventually, after this altercation, Aretha and her dad got into a compromise and they hired female manager Joe King, who was based in New York and had a lot of label connections. And her hiring, because her dad was mainly looking at male managers, was due to Aretha really insisting and persevering on what she wanted, even though her dad had attacked her physically. Aretha's career at Columbia started under the guidance of talent scout and producer John Hammond. Aretha did her first two albums at Columbia with John Hammond, and initially they had a very good working relationship. John Hammond was envisioning Aretha to be a jazz singer like Billie Holiday. And again, while Aretha did have the talent to sing jazz and be a jazz singer, this is, I think, the first kind of sign, red flag we see that at Columbia, no one really knew the raw talent that they had on their hands. And they were like, oh, we recognize this closely to be a jazz singer, so go be a jazz singer, Aretha. In 1961, Aretha released her first ever album with Columbia. It was titled Aretha and the Ray Bryant Combo. It was a jazz album. There was jazz music kind of as a backdrop to every single track of the album. The album also featured Aretha's first single to chart the Billboard Hot 100. The song was titled Won't Be Long, and it also peaked at number 7 on the R&B charts. Even though this album goes on to be the first ever album released by one of the most compelling voices of our time, it only made a mediocre splash at best. The album did a good job at showing Aretha's talent when it came to jazz, blues, and pop standards, but completely missed the mark to showcase her gospel talent, gospel singing, or even acknowledge her gospel roots. After all, Aretha Franklin came from gospel. She became famous because of her gospel singing, and that was really her secret weapon into taking over the industry. But no one at Columbia really knew how to work with that. And just like that, Aretha's career into secular music had started with uncertainty as well. But a year later, Aretha released her second album with Columbia, which she created again with producer John Hammond. And this one was a little bit different. The album was titled The Electrifying Aretha Franklin. And unlike John Hammond's initial vision for Aretha to sing in front of this like jazz music backdrop and kind of be Billie Holiday like, he wanted to really move things around and put her in the middle of a big 1940s style orchestra with strings and kind of create these big, beautiful sounds that he believed would complement Aretha. Many people thought that this was strange and it might not work, but the album did work out in a sense that the song titled Rockabye Your Baby with a Dixie Melody became Aretha's only top 40 pop song during her tenure at Columbia. By the end of 1961, she was being titled as the new star female vocalist, and this was a lot of magazines that were giving her these titles, including Downbeat magazine. After her second album, Aretha made two kind of major decisions. She stopped working with her manager Joe King, and she also stopped working with John Hammond. The instance in which she decided to stop working with John Hammond is a little bit different, and it starts when John Hammond went on vacation to Europe with his wife after the release of Aretha's second album. And while he was on vacation, he got a call from Columbia and he was informed that the label had removed him from working with Aretha and they were going to assign another producer to her and he was going to work with another artist within the company. And while he really asked for clarifications, he was never really offered one that made sense to him because from the first to the second album, he had made major improvements and they were doing much better. It really seemed like he was starting to understand Aretha and her talent better, but he was moved and he was not really given an explanation. In one of the biographies that I was reading, I think it's called Respect, he talked to the biographer and he said that he always suspected that Aretha asked for him to be moved because at the same time that Aretha was recording her second album, Columbia's subsidiary label, like a child label, was pursuing one of Aretha's sisters to become a recording artist with them. And Aretha felt a little bit threatened by that. All Franklin children, all of CL's daughters specifically, were talented singers, and Aretha was always kind of favored by CL Franklin, but her sisters were also talented singers, and one of them was being offered an opportunity to start with like a smaller label. But she didn't like that, and she always felt like John Hammond had something to do with that, and he was the one who wanted to sign her sister as well, and that's why she was kind of bitter and she chose not to work with him anymore. However, John Hammond always remained in his stance that he had nothing to do with Aretha's sister being pursued by a subsidiary label of Columbia. Another reason why Aretha's second album did well was because there were two people working on the arrangements on her album who understood her gospel background and how powerful of a gospel singer she was, that they included two tracks in the album to highlight her talents as a gospel singer. And one of these people was a man by the name Robert Mersey, and he went on to become Aretha's producer for her third album at Columbia, which was titled The Tender, the Moving, the Swinging Aretha Franklin. The album was her first to achieve commercial success, and it went on to hit number 69 on the Billboard Pop album charts. Unlike the electrifying Aretha Franklin, this album did not produce a single hit track. Unfortunately, and trust me when I tell you, I wish this was not the case. I cannot go any further in this story without introducing you to a new character by the name of Ted White. In 1961, when Aretha Franklin was 19 years old, 1 year older than 18, she met the 30-year-old Ted White. At best, Ted White was known for owning a chain of jukeboxes in Detroit and being kind of a real estate scam artist. It's the best way I can put it. But in reality, everyone who knew him or even knew of him referred to him as the Motown pimp. Aretha's brother Cecil once said that their father, quote, knew Ted was something of a shady character and he thought the association would hurt Aretha. Motown producer Harvey Fuqua told a biographer that I think was writing the book Respect on Aretha's life, quote, anyone who didn't see Ted White as a straight up pimp had to be deaf, dumb, and blind. White was in fact known as the Motown pimp. So, Ted White was not a man of character, was not good, everyone. Um, Reading about him and his relationship with Aretha and everything that he caused, it was my least favorite part of doing research for this episode. But unfortunately, within 6 months of Aretha meeting him, he kind of weaseled his way in and married Aretha. Reverend Franklin was not at all in favor of this marriage. He opposed it, and this tension caused a lot of headache for Aretha throughout her career while she was married to Ted White. And rightfully so, because as soon as they got married, Aretha appointed him as her manager, and he had no prior experience as a manager whatsoever. In 1963, Aretha was hit with the very sad news that her idol and family friend Dina Washington had passed away. As a tribute, Aretha recorded and released her fifth studio album in honor of Dina Washington, and it was titled Unforgettable, a tribute to Dina Washington. This album was also produced by Robert Mercy. In today's pop criticism and knowledge, it is kind of accepted that Aretha's years in Colombia, with the exception of this album Unforgettable that she sang for Dina Washington, was a miscast both for her and Columbia Records. Aretha then moved on to starting a collaboration with a new producer at Columbia by the name of Clyde Otis. With Otis, Aretha released two albums by the end of 1965. One was titled Running Out of Fools, and the other one was titled Yeah. None of these albums were really successful, and she struggled with the commercial success that she desired when she first signed with Columbia. Years later, Aretha herself said that those albums weren't really her and didn't showcase the style and the talent that she had. John Hammond, who started Aretha's career at Columbia, also admitted that virtually no one in the record, no executive, no founder, no one knew what to do with Aretha. They didn't know how to make songs for her, they didn't know how to promote her, how to market her albums. And it was kind of a missed opportunity both for Aretha and Columbia. Even though she did record 8 albums in 5 years, and these albums did go on to become classics over time, and we know them now and we listen to them now. At the time, they weren't hits, and everyone wanted more. Everyone wanted her to be successful commercially, and she was just not really breaking through. In the biography Respect, actually, Aretha's sister Irma talks about how, towards the last years of Aretha working with Columbia, she had fallen into some sort of a depression. In November of 1966, Aretha's contract with Columbia was up, and this is going to shock you. She actually owed money to Columbia because her albums had not sold as much as they should have. To me, that's mind blowing in the context of our current times where you can just put your music on Spotify and you will make money. But at that time, because she was a black artist and she was mainly on the R&B charts, and it was hard for her to break into the mainstream, and white radio and all of these stuff. She actually owed Colombia money. That's mind-blowing in my opinion. But during the same time, she was also performing live, and she had a lot of sets that she would do live of her own songs and songs that she would cover. And one of these songs was Respect by Otis Redding. At that point in 66, this was just a song that she had in her repertoire and she would cover when she was singing live and nothing more. However, the song did go on to become a staple in her career. But in order for that to happen, in order for Aretha to make Respect and all these other songs the way she did and break into stardom, she first had to meet a person that became a pivotal character in the rise of the star that was Aretha Franklin. A family friend of Aretha, who was also a Philadelphia DJ by the name of Louise Bishop, saw one of these live performances by Aretha and later on told her that he might be able to put her in touch with someone from a different record label. That man was no other than Jerry Wexler, who was the co founder of Atlantic Records. He started the label in New York with co founder Ahmed Ertegun and himself helped create a lot of music for big names in the space, and overall, Atlantic Records became a well regarded recording label. I guess it's important to keep in mind that it's 1966 and Aretha's still married to Ted White and he's her manager. So, in the same year, when Jerry Wexler was down in Alabama at a studio named Muscle Shoals, and he was actually trying to break up a fight that was happening inside the studio with him present, his phone rang. DJ Louise Bishop told Jerry Wexler that Aretha was ready for him and he should give her a call, and then he proceeded to give him Aretha's phone number. By that time, Jerry Wexler actually had his eye on Aretha. He wanted to sign with her and he was waiting for her contract with Columbia to be over. So he called, he talked to Ted White, and Aretha and Ted met with Jerry in New York. They did a sort of a handshake deal at the beginning, and Aretha always was very excited about her career at Atlantic. She kind of said that her years and just her career at Atlantic meant soul to her. Jerry Wexler didn't want to waste any time, so for Aretha's debut album at Atlantic, he had some big plans. And none of these plans and visions were at all similar to what the team at Columbia kept putting forward for her. He believed that Aretha's biggest asset was her gospel background and her talent as a piano player, and he really wanted to put both those things into play. Jerry Wexler proposed that Aretha should travel south to Alabama and record in the Muscle Shoals studio for her album because that way he could arrange a southern band to accompany her, and that would kind of play into her southern roots and her gospel background. Ted White did not like this because he said that Alabama was dangerous, that was a time of segregation. There was, in fact, some KKK activity near the studio, but Aretha was so eager to finally have a breakthrough in her career, and she so wanted to kind of make something out of herself and use her talent that she agreed to travel south. And after she agreed, Wexler started to kind of put together a band for her of Southern musicians, but he left the piano for Aretha to play because Jerry Wexler believed that if a singer can also play a musical instrument, they should contribute musically to their own album as well for a personal touch. On January 24th, 1967, Aretha went to the Muscle Shoals studio in Alabama and started recording her album. And that day alone is known for blasting open the bright future of Aretha Franklin and also falling into a nightmare at the same time. Ted White had a client or a friend of sorts who had created the song named I Never Loved a Man the Way I Loved You and given the demo to White, and Aretha was supposed to feature the song in her debut album at Atlantic. Prior to Aretha getting to the studio, the band had heard the song and they kind of felt like it was boring and bland and they were not really excited about it. But upon Aretha arriving, sitting at the piano, playing it the way she would play it and singing it the way she would sing it, everyone in that band was in awe, and she had instantly gained five, six, 10, however many band players were there, fans almost instantaneously. As she continued playing the piano and singing the song, each musician start playing and adding kind of their personal touch into the song. And historically, the song is known to have been recorded in a matter of a few hours, maybe even a couple of hours. And it's a beautiful song that becomes a signature of Aretha's. And as the recording of the song was coming to an end, all hell broke loose. And over 50 years later, when I try to understand what exactly happened and how it happened and why it happened, there are multiple recounts, but there is no actual solid answer as to why this happened. If you ask me, my personal opinion, allegedly based on no facts, just how I feel, I think that Ted White started to see Aretha shining brighter than ever, and he got jealous and he kind of made up excuses and created problems to stop her from shining. But again, that is just my opinion. I might be very wrong. I don't think I am. So what did happen actually? Something you need to keep in mind is that Jerry Wexler would often go to the Muscle Shoals studio in Alabama and record there, but he did not own the studio. The studio owner was a man named Hal, and he was the person in charge of the studio. He was the person who would hire the musicians that Wexler would bring forward and all of that kind of admin stuff. Hal and Wexler both had a rule of no drinking in the studio. No musician, singer, manager should ever drink while they're in the studio. However, that day, surprise, surprise, Ted White was actually drinking. And he was sharing a bottle with a trumpet player, and they both were drinking, which was against the rules, but moving on, at some point, they were both drunk and there was a verbal altercation that started. No one really knows why this verbal altercation started, who started it, what the reason was. Ted White claimed eventually that the trumpet player was using racial slurs against him. I have read multiple recounts of the story, and it's a long story. We're going to go through it. I read mostly Ted White calling the trumpet player, how other people racial slurs, calling them white trash, all of these stuff. And I also read that Ted White himself kept saying that the white people there were calling him the N word, but nowhere did I see that anyone in that studio environment had actually used that term. I'm not saying it didn't happen. There are recounts of other people across race saying that Ted White was calling people white trash and other slurs, but there are no recounts of anyone, including Aretha, of any race, saying that Ted White was called the N word. The only person who said that was White himself. So, keeping that in mind, no one really knows how the altercation started, but White was unhappy eventually with the trumpet player and he asked Wexler to fire the guy. And Wexler was like, I can't fire him. he was hired by the studio and Hal has to fire him. And Hal really didn't want to fire the guy because this was based on nothing, really. Eventually, Hal agreed, but he really resented it, and the other musicians were oblivious. Later that night, Jerry and Hal were in a hotel room in Alabama talking about the events of the day, and they got a phone call. It was Ted White, and he told Jerry Wexler that he was very upset, and Aretha was very upset, and felt disrespected, even though Aretha herself was not on the phone saying these things. And he told Wexler that him and Aretha were leaving and going back to New York in the morning, and they were not going to continue with the recording. This really upsets me because during this entire story, Aretha has never been the person to say she wants the musician fired, she wants to leave, she's unhappy. It's all white, and it all happened after she pleasantly surprised everyone with her rendition of I Never Loved a Man the Way I Love You. I sincerely think that this man was jealous at best. The conversation that Ted White was having with Jerry Wexler on the phone led to Hal going to Aretha and Ted's hotel room and having a conversation. There was yet another altercation there where Ted White called Hal racial slurs, white trash, all these stuff, and claiming over and over out loud that Hal called him the N word, and Hal kept saying, like, I have not called you the N word. And eventually, Ted White was like, okay, you didn't, but I'm sure you were thinking it. Like, I understand that just the fact that the KKK was active near that studio at that time meant that it was not a great time for Black people in the South. But I do believe that it is people like Ted White who um, use things that didn't happen and racially motivated things that didn't happen in their benefit that eventually hurt everyone. That is my opinion. After that, there are multiple recounts as to what happened. Apparently, Hal told White that he has to leave that night. He can't even stay till the morning. Some say there was physical altercation. I think Wexler at some point said that he might have heard gunshots. No one really knows what happened, but the majority of people believe and understand that all the while this was going down, Aretha was actually hiding in the bathroom because she was not having any of it. She did not want to be the part of her husband kind of ganging up on people for no reason. But regardless, the next day, Aretha and Ted had left Alabama. This meant that the recording was no longer in session, and Wexler had to find Aretha and reschedule everything, but he could not find her. And rightfully so, because when you think about it, the trumpet player messed up by drinking, Ted White messed up by doing everything, just by merely existing at that point. Hal messed up by going to their room and confronting Ted White, who was an aggressive, bitter man. Jerry Wexler messed up by just not showing the backbone necessary. Really, everyone messed up in this situation except for who? Aretha Franklin, the artist, the talented woman who sang something so beautifully, it mesmerized everyone and put her husband into like a jealous rage. Yet she was paying for it, and she was not happy about that. After trying to find Aretha and not being successful, Wexler realized that Aretha had been traumatized by the incident and also kind of embarrassed because her husband and her manager were part of it, and this happened in front of all the musicians and Wexler, and Wexler was also at fault there. And he realized the only way he can kind of lure her out and make sure the contract doesn't go annulled is to make a public apology and invited her back to New York. When Aretha agreed to go back to the New York studios to keep recording, she insisted that the musicians from Alabama are also present in New York because she wanted to continue working with them. She also brought her sisters Irma and Carolyn to accompany her as backup vocalists, and thankfully, Ted White was not present during these recording sessions. On February 8th, 1967, Aretha put the finishing touches on the song I Never Loved a Man the Way I Loved You. This was a song that she recorded down in Alabama before all hell broke loose, and 2 days later, Jerry Wexler released the song and it was an instant hit, peaked at number 1 on the Billboard's R&B singles chart and at number 9 on the pop charts. Everyone knew that this was going to be an instant hit, and really it kind of started a great successful journey for Aretha and her debut album at Atlantic. On Valentine's Day 1967, Aretha made history when she sang Respect in New York at the Atlantic Records studio. She also played the piano for the same song, and this rendition that was originally for Otis Redding instantly became Aretha's signature song, to the point that Redding himself said that Aretha deserves to be recognized with the song because she put her own personal touch on it. This song went on to become the anthem for women's movement as well as the civil rights movement. The full album, I Never Loved a Man the Way I Love You, came out in the March of same year, and it was Aretha's 10th album overall, studio album, and it was her first album with Atlantic Records. And after a series of unsuccessful albums at Columbia, where she was constantly releasing jazz standards, she had finally broken through and she was achieving the success she always knew she could achieve. This album was her first top 10 album in the United States, and it reached number 2 on the Billboard 200. Both Respect and I Never Loved the Man the Way I Love You topped Billboard 100, and I Never Loved the Man actually reached number 10. At the time, the album only received mixed reviews, but today we know that it was a masterpiece. It went on to be featured in 500 Greatest Albums of All Time by the Rolling Stone magazine. And of course, Respect is now one of Aretha's signature songs, even years after her passing away. Working with Jerry Wexler and Atlantic made Aretha becoming one of the most successful singers in America. And I want to add something here, and that is how Jerry Wexler treated Aretha. Aretha was always very much influenced by the men around her, whether it was her dad from an early age being her manager, kind of even picking which record she signed with initially, and kind of even picking the manager, as we talked about, and then having Ted White being in the mix, and even starting at Columbia with John Hammond, later on with her brother. And all these men really treated her, but I'm not necessarily talking about her brother out here, but the rest of them really treated her that in a way that affected her self-confidence. And she wasn't sure if she had a voice when it came to the artistic side and the production side of her music. And it was Jerry Wexler who really made sure that Aretha is given the voice, she's given the platform, and she's given the opportunity to contribute artistically and within the production of her own music. And that was a big factor in the growth of Aretha, both personally and professionally. Between the release of her first album and working on her second album at Atlantic, Aretha was touring in the South. And at this point, she was still married to Ted White, and the marriage was not good. It was abusive on his side. It was very bitter. It was not a very happy or successful marriage. And this marriage was so hard on Aretha that, according to her friends and family, she had unfortunately turned to booze sometimes to numb the pain of just this entire marriage that she was now entangled in. So while she was touring in the South, during a performance, she fell down on the stage and she shattered her elbow. But sooner than later, she felt like she was ready to go back. And this was even before the doctors agreed that her shattered elbow was fixed and she could play the piano. Regardless, she chose to go back to the studio. And for her second album at Atlantic with Jerry Wexler, which was titled Aretha Arrives, I love the title. She played the piano even with her shattered elbow. She tried to play it in the slower songs and sometimes accompanying just with her left hand. But she recorded it, she sang, and she was as good as always. In 1968, Aretha released two more albums with Wexler at Atlantic. These albums were Lady Soul and Aretha Now. Both albums had hits. These two albums actually include some of the most famous songs by Aretha Franklin that I think most people have heard. Lady Soul had multiple hit singles, including Chain of Fools at number 2 in the pop charts, You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman, co written by Carole King, which was number 8 in the pop charts, and Sweet Baby Since You've Been Gone, which was number 5 in the pop charts. The album sold over 1 million copies in the United States and achieved gold status. Following her commercial and artistic success, Aretha decided to go on a European tour. She toured in Germany, Holland, France, Switzerland, and the UK. Her performance in France was also live recorded and released as a live album. But finally, in 1969, she divorced Ted White. Good riddance, Ted. So happy I don't have to really talk about you anymore, man. And the same year, she released her new album with the production of Jerry Wexler titled Soul 69. Nowadays, we kind of look at Soul 69 as an overlooked album because, in its entirety, it was great, but maybe because it didn't really produce any hits, most people don't listen to it or don't refer to it. But regardless, it was a success artistically and commercially. Between 1970 and 1972, Aretha released some of her most authentic work. This was also partially due to the fact that at this time she was dating a man by the name of Ken Cunningham, who really encouraged her to embrace her Black African American roots. Within this 2 year period, she released 3 studio albums. In 1970, she released 2 albums titled This Girl's in Love with You and Spirit in the Dark. And in 1972, she released Young, Gifted, and Black, which is one of her most acclaimed albums. She also released 2 live albums, which were Aretha Live at Fillmore West in 1971, and of course, Amazing Grace in 1972. And even though she did release a lot of albums in this period, her personal life was a little bit difficult as well. She was still dealing with the aftermath of her divorce from Ted White, her new relationship with Ken Cunningham, which also gave her another son. And Aretha was not really as public as she used to be. Her public appearances and performances were very often canceled to the point that no one was really surprised anymore. And somewhere I read that Jerry Wexler said no one was necessarily using the word nervous breakdown, but everyone was kind of thinking about it. If you think about it, starting from 68, it wasn't just that personally she was having a hard time. Of course, the assassination and death of MLK Jr. was both personal to her as a friend of the family, but also as a Black woman in America. She was dealing with how the public was portraying her. She was also dealing with how Ted White was treating her. She then got into a new relationship with very fast resulted in a pregnancy and a new child. And up until like 72, Aretha was very confused, both in her personal life, with regards to how her relationships were going on, how the men were treating her, but also kind of as a Black person in America and how she was being mistreated as a part of a community. And all of these resulted in a lot of mixed emotions for her. But just like a lot of other things in life, you are never down for long. And that's what Aretha did. She came back in 1972. She recorded and released her album Young, Gifted, and Black, where she covered the title song by Nina Simone in a church choir like atmosphere. And it really brought back hope and dignity to herself and her community. And overall, she really believed that within like the suffering that everyone goes through, there is always hope. And this hope is not necessarily the premise of freedom just for one group or one culture. It's for our planet, it's for the earth and everyone who is dealing with that on this earth. And that is something I really like about Aretha. I really admire the fact that she was above a lot of things that we might not necessarily be above today. She was a Black woman in America. She saw someone that she was very close with at a very young age, Dr. King, get assassinated. She saw how she was being treated as a Black woman publicly. She saw how Black people in America were treated publicly. She saw the Vietnam War. She saw all of these things, yet she never claimed that the message of hope and freedom that her songs were carrying was exclusive to her culture or her race or her country. She always wanted to kind of convey the message that this is for everyone on this earth. She even, when she was titled the Queen of Soul, there were a lot of people around her, including like Ella Fitzgerald, um, that tried to communicate with her what soul really meant and what she had to talk about and how soul interacted with the African American community. And she, as a result of that, Aretha has a very famous quote where she talks about the fact that she doesn't think that soul belongs to a specific group or race or culture. She said that she can name off the top of her head two or three white French singers who sing with soul. And she always said that she believes soul music is for anyone who wants to reflect honesty in their music. And I really admire that about Aretha Franklin. And I think a lot of times that's what you really hear in her music. She is talking about her own suffering. She is talking about the suffering of her people or the hope or in any feeling, any emotion, but it never, to me at least, felt like um, she had an exclusive claim on it. And unfortunately, that's not something I can say about every single artist. Following the release of Young, Gifted, and Black, Aretha released her live album Amazing Grace, which was a gospel album, and it's one of her famous albums again. And at that point in time, the gospel audience was kind of known for shunning gospel singers who would venture into secular music. And when she was asked to comment about this kind of migration back and forth, she offered her own commentary in New York's black newspaper called Amsterdam News. And I'm going to read from it because I think it's important to read it exactly as she wrote it herself. She said, quote, "I don't think that in any matter I did the Lord a disservice when I made up my mind to switch over. After all, the blues is a music born out of the slavery days sufferings of my people. Every song in the blues vein has a story to tell of love, frustration, and heartaches. Her live Amazing Grace album was received with critical and commercial success. She won 2 Grammys for it, and I believe to this day it is the best selling live gospel album. This album was recorded live at the New Bethel Baptist Church in Detroit, the same church that Aretha grew up in, over 2 nights. And Wexler helped set up the equipment and everything for Aretha to be able to record there. I think at the first night, Mick Jagger actually was in the audience as well. It was a historic moment when while it was recorded, and the reception of it is also quite historic. But after this era, Aretha kind of went south artistically and commercially speaking. She started developing a friendship with Quincy Jones, and she wanted him as a producer on her next album, and Wexler agreed as well. But according to Wexler, Quincy Jones was not the fastest person when it came to uh, finalizing the production and releasing it. And the album that came out of that was Aretha's least successful album ever, if I'm not wrong. And the rest of the albums she did while at Atlantic did not do as well compared to this 2, 3 year period at the end of the 60s and beginning of the 70s. She did a full soundtrack album, Sparkle, and it was successful commercially, but overall, she was not seeing the success of her early days at Atlantic. It was around this time that she also broke up with Ken Cunningham. And again, because she is a very private person, we don't know a lot about the nature of this breakup. But soon after, she met actor Glenn Truman at a party in Los Angeles. Aretha and Glenn really hit it off and started a romantic relationship. During this time, Aretha was also starting to see a bit of competition in form of other female black singers, and she was not happy about it. She was, during her career at Atlantic, offered quite a few songs that she rejected. And because they were Aretha Franklin rejects, they were offered to another singer by the name of Natalie Cole, who sang them and turned them into hits. And she got famous for them and she won Grammys for them. And Aretha was not at all happy about it. She was not very welcoming to Natalie Cole when she started entering the scene, and she didn't stop really feeling threatened by her until she started singing pop songs in the 90s. But going back to the media's treatment and portrayal of Aretha, in the sense that she was also seeing new rivals, they did not help the situation either. In 1977, Jet magazine had a cover. On it, there was a picture of Diana Ross, Aretha Franklin, and Natalie Cole. And basically, they were questioning whether or not there is enough room for all of these 3 women to be active in the R&B and also pop music. In my opinion, that is not okay. Of course, there is enough room for 3 women. They were being unreasonable when they questioned whether or not 3 Black women can exist in the same industry, because now we're seeing that even more than that is possible. But the media really did like kind of creating fights and animosity between these women. Later that year, Aretha had plans to have a large UK tour. She was scheduled to play 60 different venues in the UK. It had been a long time since she played in Europe, and everyone was very excited. But last minute, she canceled due to a contractual issue. I think there was a disagreement basically, and she canceled her tour and she got sued by the promoters of the event and she had to pay a lot financially as a result of that. Her personal life was also a little bit weird during this time. When she met Glenn Truman, she had her own children. Some of them were adults by now, some of them were much younger, especially her child with Cunningham. And Truman also had his own children. And she really wanted to blend the two families, but it came with a lot of challenges and a lot of pressure, both publicly and privately. But Aretha was very determined to kind of blend these two families together. She really liked Glenn Truman, and her sisters and her close friends have always said that Aretha had this very romanticized view of life, and she always envisioned kind of um fairy tale life for herself with like a knight in shining armor, and she truly believed that Glenn Truman was that man and she wanted to make it work. And she kind of did for a while at least. In late 1977, Glenn Truman proposed to Aretha. She accepted, and the couple got married in 78. The wedding was beautiful. It was a star-studded affair. It, of course, was at the New Bethel Baptist Church in Detroit with Aretha's father there. There were a lot of musicians who performed. It was reported in the media. But something interesting about this wedding is that it almost didn't happen. Before getting married, and this was Aretha's second husband, he was an actor. I'm sure he was well off. I'm sure he was doing well. But Aretha at that point was the electrifying Aretha Franklin. She was the queen of soul. And I'm sure her divorce from my favorite person, not Ted White, was not the greatest. So she was very firm in the fact that she wanted a prenup. She had her lawyers draft one, she sent it to Glenn Truman, and up until the day of the wedding, she had not received um, the prenup back. Truman had not signed it, he had not sent it back to her, and she would have not gone through with the wedding without that prenup. And I think like an hour or two before the wedding, she got the prenup back and it was signed, and the marriage actually became legal. Both their children were at the wedding, and it really seemed like Aretha was getting her fairy tale wedding and her chance at romance. Aretha's last three albums at Atlantic were Almighty Fire, Sweet Passion, and La Diva, each one of them selling less than the one before. She was really far from her days of glory at Atlantic. These were due to multiple factors. One of them, according to Aretha's brother, was the fact that disco was becoming the craze and it was taking over the music scene. But Aretha was very reluctant into kind of experimenting with the genre. He told Aretha that the Bee Gees, who are being very successful with disco, actually had roots in R&B, which means that she can also use her background in R&B to kind of succeed in disco. But Aretha didn't like it, even though her album La Diva was kind of disco. She was always like, no, this is modern R&B. Disco is a craze. I'm above it. I'm not going to give into it. And she was not at all flexible. And I mean, of course, her sales really took a hit because of it. Another reason that Aretha talks about is the fact that Atlantic was not really promoting her work the way they should have. I'm not sure if this was the case. That is not really here nor there. Ahmet Ertegun, who was the co founder of Atlantic, and he was there until Aretha's very last day with the company, said that this was not something new. Everyone kind of was aware of the fact that once a singer or an artist starts to decline commercially, They often blame the label and don't really take any part of the blame themselves. So they were not really surprised that this was happening. And Erdogan really wanted to keep Aretha at Atlantic. He talked to her brother, who was her manager at the time, and kind of offered a complete album with the help of Bee Gees, with like modern R&B disco, that would really rejuvenate her career. And while this sounded interesting to Aretha at first, eventually she was like, "No, I'm not really into this." And Atlantic ended up making that album for Barbara Streisand, which was very successful yet again. And the best Aretha could do was to act indifferent with regards to yet another opportunity that she kind of pushed away. But also, while all of this was happening, in June of 79, after a live performance, Aretha walked off the stage to the news that her father was shot during a home invasion robbery in Detroit. At first, the people who kind of like were giving them the news were not really helpful, and they said that CL had died and everyone was in shock. Eventually they realized that he was not dead, but he was heavily injured and he was in a coma which unfortunately didn't really recover from until his death. But at that point, at the time that CL Franklin was shot, there was a lot of speculation as to what had really happened. Was it really a robbery, or was it because of his colorful life and his experiences in infidelities and his kind of, I think, a year or two prior to that, this of course wasn't legal at the time. He had a record of like carrying marijuana with him. So there was a lot of speculation, but regardless, whether we like it or not, he was shot during a home invasion. When this happened to the Reverend Franklin, Aretha dropped everything. She went back to Detroit to take care of her father. She said that she was going to put her career on hold. She was not going to do anything career wise because she wanted to really focus on her father. But the thing was, home care, around the clock care for someone who's in a coma, was very expensive. And Aretha was not the kind of person who was known for her savings. She needed to work. And aside from the financial part of it, she needed to work to just kind of help her mental status, because just dropping everything, dropping your family, your husband, your work, and going to Detroit and just like staying there was not really something that was good for her either. So soon after, she decided to go back to work, and she was presented with the opportunity to take part in a movie. And she always thought she was gonna do like a drama movie. She always thought that she can really bring forward those like dramatic emotions. But this opportunity was far from that. She actually had a role in the movie Blues Brothers. And even though the role was small, she took over the hearts of the audience, especially when she sang the song Think. And she once again showed everyone that there is not a lot that Aretha Franklin can't do. Now we're entering Aretha's years at Arista Records, and this was her longest partnership with a label. She was there from 1980 to 2007, so about 26, 7 years long, and she achieved quite a bit during these years. By the time her contract was up at Atlantic and she was thinking about leaving the company, Aretha asked her brother to kind of shop around and see what offers she's going to get. She specifically asked about Arista because she really wanted to work with Clive Davis, who was at Arista, and he was a man who was known for rejuvenating many careers before Aretha. While Cecil, her brother, was kind of looking around for new deals, what a lot of record companies told him was that the price that Aretha was asking for her new deal was not really something that matched her a track record at the time, and it was over what she was worth technically. But Clive Davis and Arista were actually willing to pay that price. And for her first two albums at Arista, which were titled Aretha and Love All the Hurt Away, Aretha worked with Arif Mandrin, who was a producer she had previously worked with. He was very gentle in his approach, and Aretha liked working with him. The albums were good. They had some success both in singles and as an album, but in general, it wasn't until Aretha started working on her third album that she really started getting back on top of what her glory days were. In 1981, Clive Davis brought in producer Luther Vandross to work on Aretha's third album. Vandross was doing really well with his works in the R&B and pop charts at the time, and he was very accomplished in his own right. But upon meeting Aretha for the first time, Aretha was very standoffish and closed off to him, and she kind of asked him to show her what kind of music he had, what kind of songs he had to offer to her. And Vandross at some point said that it really felt like he had to audition for Aretha, which he was happy to do, and he did it. And together they started creating Aretha's third album at Arista titled Jump to It. This album was a hit for many reasons, but specifically because it really touched the gospel roots and that sense of gospel music that Aretha always carried with her and in her voice. And that's why it really was produced beautifully and resonated with the audience well. The album resulted in Aretha's first top 40 in years, and also the album itself was number 23 in the charts, which was something Aretha had not experienced in I think about a decade at that point. And just like that, Aretha was back, and it was thanks to this great partnership that she had with Luther Vandross professionally that she had these hits. She won Grammys again. She was back on the charts, but she had a very complex and interesting relationship with Luther Vandross. Very often, she got into arguments with him. I think it was Vandross who said there were really two sides to Aretha, one that she kind of concealed and it was a private side of her, and the other side was the more kind of neurotic, maybe tumultuous side of her that she often showed, to the point that if they were rehearsing and they were recording and Vandross was like, I think you can do this differently, or he gave her any slight comment, she would immediately shout to the recount of Vandross, and she would shout at him basically and say, if you can sing it better, come here and sing it. This is how I sing it. And then she would start to leave. And Vandross, at the direction of Clive Davis, had to apologize to her multiple times, just because he gave her kind of a little bit of an advice. So there was like a very complex layer on top of this professional relationship between the two of them. But while they had this kind of like cat and mouse game going on professionally, he did have a special place in her heart, and Aretha actually did fly to Luther Vandross's funeral years later. After 1983 and the release of this album, something happened personally to Aretha that really affected her professionally as well as personally. While she was taking a small prop plane for a red eye flight, she recounted that the plane had some issues. It dropped multiple times. Aretha claims that once it like kind of went upside down, and that gave her a fear of flying. And she would always, after that point, use the bus to travel cross country. This actually also meant that she could not participate in the Broadway musical that was being created about Mahalia Jackson and her life, and she was offered the leading role in it. I think there was also a lawsuit associated with it, but this trauma, the PTSD that she carried from this plane incident was so big that she never really shook it off. In 1984, the Reverend Franklin passed away due to the complications of the gunshot wound that he was struggling with for years. And after his passing, there was a lot of talk about how Aretha was handling this. She was very upset, of course, very sad that she lost her father, especially because once he got shot and he needed care, she eventually moved back and tried to take care of him. Even though she was working, she was always there with him. And her sister Carolyn was actually the person who publicly, I think, raised her kind of concerns for Aretha's well-being and how she was handling this loss. And of course, that did not sit well with Aretha, and um, she didn't talk to her own sister for a while. And a lot of this was, of course, because her father was a big, important character in her life, and now she had lost him and she was dealing with that. But also, 2 years prior to her father's passing in 1982, Aretha had separated from her husband, actor Glenn Truman, and by 84, she actually got a divorce from him. There are a lot of speculations as to how the marriage ended, but the cause was, and it's not just that Aretha was very closed off about this. She might have spread a bit of misinformation around this matter because for the 2 years that they were separated, there was a lot of public and private conversations about the end of this marriage. But even to her own sisters and her friends, she kind of lied and kept up this appearance that everything was fine and there was nothing wrong, which was not really the case in reality. And there has been some speculations. Of course, this part is not speculated that Glenn Truman was also an actor. He was well known, but he was not as well known as Aretha Franklin, especially during that time. And he might have not really liked being like an afterthought in their marriage with regards to their celebrity status, which is a weird thing, but it is speculated that might have been a thing. But also, there are some reports that right before they separated, Aretha found out that Glenn Truman was cheating on her with someone that Aretha was very close with. The name of this person was not mentioned, but regardless, this really hurt Aretha and made her even more closed off when it came to her private relationships. In 84, Aretha released another album with Arista titled Who's Zoomin' Who, and it was kind of a take on an idiom that she very often used. The album did well commercially, it had hit songs, but amongst critics and people who had previously worked with Aretha, it didn't really seem like it was an authentic piece of work, and that's how it was mainly regarded as. In 87, she released a live album titled One Lord, One Faith, One Baptism. This was also recorded in her family church. A few years after her father's passing, her sisters sang the backup vocals to this album. And Aretha was very insistent on kind of doing everything related to this album herself. Part of it might have been because she really wanted to have things the way she wanted, because it was also, in the memory of her father. But on the other hand, this might have been because she did not trust anyone. She did not trust her sisters, not Wexler from Atlantic, not no one from Arista because it was a live album. She did not trust anyone and she just didn't want anyone to help her, and she put everything together, and the outcome was not as great as her previous live album Amazing Grace. And the album kind of started to illustrate Aretha's lack of trust in everyone and anyone around her, as opposed to this beautiful gospel tribute to her father and her roots to the church. By 1993, Aretha Franklin was a nationally known and celebrated artist. This year, she performed at President Bill Clinton's inaugural ball. She performed the song I Dream a Dream. Very interesting when you think about it. She's like a gospel blues soul singer, and that's a very classic Broadway show tune. But she sang this so beautifully and she put her own spin on it. If you're interested in viewing it, I can also try and put a link down below. But basically, she blew everyone out of the water. She took her own spin on yet another classic and it worked. It always works. If it's Aretha, it always works. Overall, the 90s were a time of recognition for Aretha and her achievements as a musician. In 94, at the age of 52, Aretha was the recipient of the Kennedy Center Honors. Although 72 is middle age, it's not very young, it's not very old. For someone to receive the honor at this age is not very common, and that age is considered to be very young if someone's the recipient then. I think at the same year that she was receiving this honor, the rest of the honorees were like Kirk Douglas and Hal Prince, which shout out, but different story. The recipients were much older and, of course, not in their 50s. So for her to receive it at that age is also kind of an achievement on its own. She also got a lifetime achievement at the Grammys, which was yet another way for the industry to recognize and appreciate her for all of her contributions within like the 4 or 5 decades that she had been working in the industry by that time. But throughout this 4 or 5 decade long career, Aretha's feud with other female, especially Black singers, was almost as famous as her songs. She had known to have feuds with virtually everyone. We talked about Natalie Cole, and there's Diana Ross, I think Tina Turner, Whitney Houston, Dionne Warwick, Patti LaBelle. Patti LaBelle and Aretha Franklin actually refused to be on the same stage together. And one of Aretha's sisters, Irma, I think, actually believed that part of this was her personality, and we've talked about that. And part of it just really came with the job. And no one could use this not so great aspect of Aretha's career better than Clive Davis. He really looked at it the same way that we look at reality TV these days. He believed that if there is drama, people will come for it and they'll stay for the music, basically. Not that Aretha needed any kind of false advertisement for people to listen to her music, but it really was a marketing tactic that he used to keep Aretha top of mind as she entered her like sixth decade within the music industry. But during this era of triumph and success, especially being nationally recognized, Aretha was also carrying a deep pain and sorrow with her because in the late 80s, two of her siblings, her sister and her brother, passed away due to cancer. And it was very hard for her to kind of cope with it and move on, especially because she eventually ended up dealing with the same things and at that point, really by that point in her public life, she might have not been well equipped in handling the situation. After Jump to It, Aretha never really had any commercial mass success again. In 1998, her single A Rose Is Still a Rose was on the top 40, which was still an achievement for her. But in the same year, I would say, in my opinion, the second most impressive thing in Aretha's career happened. Without being super public about it, Aretha was practicing opera music for a while. This was not because she wanted to perform necessarily. She just really liked music and she was a lifelong learner of music, even if it was not in the same style that everyone else learns music. She was learning classical opera singing and she had her like little tape recorder that had the song on it, and she would kind of practice to it. And in 1998, during a charity event, she sang a song that is known to be a signature of the Italian singer Luciano Pavarotti. He, of course, is a tenor. He has a different kind of voice register and he sings it differently. But Aretha had practiced and performed it in the way that she could and she was comfortable with. And it was a beautiful performance. But the thing was, 2 nights after this charity event, the Grammy Awards was supposed to happen. It was a live broadcasted event. Aretha was supposed to perform her song Respect, and Pavarotti was supposed to perform Nessun Dorma, which is the song that Aretha performed in that charity. On the day of the Grammys, everything was fine. They went and they did their sound check. Aretha did her own, Pavarotti did his own. And the thing was, Pavarotti had a 60-piece live orchestra and 20 backup vocalists live with him on stage. And when they did the rehearsals and they did the sound check, everything was set in his key for his performance, for his voice register. And he's a tenor. You know him, you know how he sings. And that was that. The show starts and Aretha goes on stage. She performs her song Respect. Everything is fine. She comes down, she goes to her dressing room, and the producers go to her and they tell her that because of a medical emergency, Pavarotti had to cancel last minute. And they had like this entire performance rehearsed and scheduled for him, and he just can't do it anymore. And she asked what song it was. They confirmed it was the same song. And she asked if it was arranged for him. And they said, yes, of course. And she immediately knew it was not going to work because their voice is different, completely different. So she did not say no. She actually asked to hear the music a little bit to confirm on her own accord that it was just not going to work. As soon as she heard the music, she knew that it was in a different key than what she sings, and it would not work basically. But the resilient woman that Aretha Franklin was, she said, "Sure, how much time do I have?" And they were like, 20 minutes. You have to be on stage in 20 minutes. And she was like, "Yeah, I'll do it. Just give me 20 minutes to practice with this music and my little tape recorder." And they agreed. And 20 minutes later, this woman went on stage, accompanied by a 60-piece orchestra, vocalists, 20 vocalists, and she sang her rendition of a very difficult opera ballad, and she received a standing ovation. No one believed it. It was a miracle. She was truly a miracle worker. Goosebumps as I'm talking about this. And I would say the 5 decades of her doing her own songs, but also covering classic songs from Over the Rainbow, from The Wizard of Oz, that I think she did in her first album, to covering the Beatles, Rolling Stones, Nina Simone, Billie Holiday, everyone. It it really helped her put her own spin on music. And I think it became really a very cherished part of her legacy. Unfortunately, in 2001, Aretha lost her other sister, Irma, and 9 weeks after, she lost her half brother, Vaughn, who was also her manager at the time. In 2005, because of her contributions to American music and culture, she was formally recognized when she received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President George W. Bush. And I think this goes to show, we're going to talk about it right now, actually. In 2009, she performed in the inauguration of President Barack Obama and kind of Going back, she also was in many national conventions for the DNC. She performed for Jimmy Carter. She was invited to perform at President Trump's inauguration as well, but I think she was at that point too ill to attend and she declined. And I think, kind of looking at this, we can also gather an interesting image of Aretha and her art kind of going beyond the American party lines and the divisive kind of atmosphere that everyone lives in America. She was loved and cherished by virtually everyone, regardless of age, race, culture, political affiliation. And a lot of it, I think, goes back to her own credit because from very early on, she put forward this claim that my art, my music is not just for my race, not just for my cause, not just for my fight. It is for everyone who's fighting for freedom. It is for everyone on earth who needs hope, who needs kind of to be inspired for resistance, who needs to demand respect. And I think that's just very important for us to keep in mind. In 2007, after decades of working on this image of self confidence that she needed, Aretha left Arista Records and started her own recording label titled Aretha Records. She released her first album under her own label titled A Woman Falling Out of Love. One of Aretha's final performances that I always love talking about. I love watching it even. And we talked about this kind of at the beginning of the story when I talked about Clara Ward casting off her hat and it making a full circle journey throughout Aretha's career is about her performance in 2015 at the Kennedy Center when Carole King was receiving the honor. Carole King was the person who co-wrote "You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman," a song that is kind of on the top two list of Aretha. And to honor her, Aretha, while she was sick and while she was going through a lot of personal issues, did make an appearance. And she performed on stage at the Kennedy Center. She performed the same song. She started by playing the piano and singing. And towards the bridge of the song, she actually got up and she took off the fur coat that she had on and she kind of threw it on the ground. I don't know if you can see it, goosebumps really. And this was kind of to acknowledge Carole King's career and show her how important and how emotional this journey had been. And it is kind of known within gospel culture that when you do that, it means, especially on a funeral, in a funeral, on a casket of a deceased person, it means that the person might have kind of passed on, but their legacy continues. And she kind of wanted to convey that as well. And I think it's very beautiful thinking about it from when she was like a 9-year-old girl looking at Clara Ward doing this to kind of being in a position where she can pay respect to a colleague and a coworker, doing that and kind of making a sitting president of the United States, Barack Obama, cry. Um, it's a beautiful performance. I will also link that below for you. And it's how I usually like to remember Aretha Franklin. Aretha's last public performance in a format of a concert was in September of 2017, and her last performance publicly ever was in 2018 at the Elton John Foundation, and that was on November of 2017. But sadly, on August 16, 2018, Aretha Franklin passed away. Her death, of course, initiated the outpour of love and support for her and her legacy, her family, and her children. She had a very big funeral in Detroit in the church that she grew up in. Many people eulogized her. There were a lot of performances done. And for her funeral, Reverend Jasper Williams Jr. of Salem Baptist Church, who eulogized her father as well, delivered Aretha's eulogy. He was kind of criticized for the eulogy that he delivered because it ended up being a little bit too politically motivated. I understand that in 2018 in America, pretty much everything was political, especially when you're eulogizing someone like Aretha Franklin. Um, However, she deserved to be recognized for the amazing life and career that she had, of course, for her contributions to the civil rights movement, but also just as a female Black artist who really rose to fame nationally, internationally, and created many songs that are going to stay with us forever. Aretha's career spanned over 6 decades and crossed various musical styles, including gospel, jazz, soul, and pop. Not only did she blur the lines between genres and garnered fans from all walks of life and ages, she also paved the way for the soul and R&B musicians in America to succeed on mainstream platforms. Even after announcing her retirement in 2017, Aretha's legacy continues to be groundbreaking and historical, leaving a profound mark on the world of music. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. This was the life of Aretha Franklin. I hope you liked this. I hope you liked the story. If you have any comments, if you have any questions, if there is someone that you would really like me to talk about, please feel free to comment under this video. If you liked this video, please don't forget to like it, put a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel. I am going to put these videos out on a weekly basis, but I'm also going to put out other videos on other days of the week. I am going to talk about the musical history of different cities, for example, and the history of very famous albums, for example. So if those are the things that you like, feel free to subscribe, and I really thank you for staying here with me. I hope you like this. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, I hope you have a great holiday season, great new year, and I'll see you very soon. Bye.